All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar entitled Transforming Clinical Development via a Data-Centric, Platform-Based Technology Approach. Today we're going to be joined by some great speakers from a company called ResultsWorks, which is an Asterix company. But before we get into that, let me take a moment and tell you a little bit about who Asterix is. We can go to the next slide, please. And then we will jump into the content. So, quick company snapshot. If you haven't attended an Asterix webinar before, this will give you a little background into exactly who we are. For about 25 years now, our unique breadth of highly specialized services, processes, and technology has enabled Asterix to be a leading partner in transforming the ways science-based businesses succeed. We were founded by scientists to solve unique challenges in life sciences and other science-based operations. We offer a growing array of strategic, technical, and staffing services dedicated to enabling our clients to make sure quality is ever present and deliver the scientific outcomes that improve the lives of people everywhere. Ultimately, that's our goal. A couple of quick facts about the company. We were established in 1995 and are privately held. We started as an IT division of APBI, which is a life science research organization. Today, we operate from 7 locations in the United States and beautiful Costa Rica, and our headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey. The type of companies that we work with and the type of companies that we help are everyone from Fortune 1000 life science enterprises to chemical and CPG companies to government agencies through research institutions. So that's a little bit about Asterix. I want to now turn our attention to our very capable speakers for today. We have Susan Butler, who's Vice President of Consulting Services at ResultsWorks, Bob O'Hara, Vice President of Business Development, and Michael Smart, Principal Consultant, again, all with ResultsWorks, which is an Asterix company. So, Bob, I think you're going to kick us off, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you. I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation. I'll come back on at the end to help field questions.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the intro, and I'm glad to be here joining everybody today. Before we dig into the meat of our presentation, just wanted to give you a little bit of a drill down into ResultWorks. As Kevin said, we've just recently joined the Asterix family, and ResultWorks has been in business previously for 18 years, and we have focused on these 4 practice areas. We've done a lot of work in strategy innovation, strategic innovation, and you're going to hear some of the results of that today in the discussion around clinical development strategy. We do a lot of work in integrated business analysis. That's kind of more traditional consulting, current state, future state, gap analysis, system selection across the R&D portfolio. We do a lot of work in the technology and architecture world, again, looking at R&D technology infrastructure. And then digital management and governance, which is a lot about data governance and digital asset management and so on. And as you see along the bottom, we work across the R&D spectrum and all the way into manufacturing. So we cover the range quite effectively. And we're very pleased to be here today for the first time as an Asterix business. And we're glad to share with you some of our work. So I'm going to introduce Susan Butler, who will, I'm going to go through the agenda first. So our webinar objectives for today, we're going to talk about clinical development technology trends. So that's first, and then we'll talk about ways to enable that technology in clinical development, and then we'll talk about the transformation process. So with that, I will introduce Susan Butler, who will kind of tee up the technology trends.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Kevin, for the intros. Thank you to everyone who's in attendance. We appreciate you participating in the webinar today. I really just wanted to start off by setting the stage for what we're seeing in terms of change within clinical development. There's 3 primary areas where we see a lot of evolution that's impacting the way we look at clinical development and the conduct of trials within clinical development. For one thing, we see, and Bob, if you could just click along, we see emerging trial needs. So here we're seeing the work, as I'm sure many of you know, is changing pretty significantly, and COVID certainly expedited some of that in terms of new trial paradigms and the need to address emerging needs for decentralized trials, telemedicine, and other areas that are really critical as we start to think about how we approach clinical trials. That includes things like direct patient access to both the trials and the data. And then stemming from that, use of real-world data and simulations in the analyses, and ensuring that the data, especially since patients are accessing that data as well as scientists and clinicians, is presented in contextual, user-friendly ways. And that's true both internally and externally. If you could go forward. Similarly, we're seeing increased complexity in our environment. The ecosystem is quite, has been in place for a while. We've seen a lot of silos and those kinds of things. So with the increase in volume and diversity of the data we're collecting, that needs to be addressed. It's creating some gaps. We have more and more vendors and partners who are working together around our trials. Data is not consistent in the way it comes in, and not everyone is following the same data standards. It's also complicated to share and reuse that data, some because of those standards not being aligned. But we need that data to be able to run trial analytics, but also to look cross-functionally and be able to drive and inform clinical programs, trial design, et cetera. And that lack of consistency and uniform data platforms really leads to onerous ability to access and use our data in the way we need to. Good, click forward. And at the same time, we're seeing major changes happening in technology. So we're obviously, and some of these aren't quite emerging anymore, eSource isn't really emerging at this point, but we have more and more digital patient engagement. eSource is part of it, but the use of wearables, sensors, other technologies and devices is influencing things. Increased capacity and capabilities around automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the ability to use knowledge graphs and semantic layers, natural language processing and natural language generation are all emerging capabilities that we want to be able to take advantage of. And also our vendors are changing, although some of them still are on older technologies, I would say. They're all working towards moving to newer technology infrastructure, and we need to be positioned and ready to take care of that, as well as thinking about cybersecurity, privacy, and how blockchain applies in all that as well. If you could click forward. So with that as a backdrop, you know, today we have complex, very siloed, usually brittle or aging environments, and we're moving to a future that's really needs to be nimble, integrated, data-centric, and platform-centric. And we'll talk a little more in a minute about what we mean by data-centric and platform-centric. But the idea is to make sure we reduce our technical debt and we create a capability to have shared platforms that are used across the organization. And we want to make sure we're applying fair data principles as we go. So how do we get there? How do we leverage those emerging technologies? How do we have a future that is based on smart architecture design and be able to move to that future? I'm going to let Michael Smart take over at this point and discuss you know, where we're going forward. Prior to that, I just wanted to mention, you know, there is a lot of work that's available out there, and it's important as we go into it to really understand the technology trends and the data that and the technologies that are emerging as we go forward, and how we can leverage those. So as we work with our clients, we're often identifying those trends, helping to make sure everyone involved in any effort we're doing is informed about them, and using that as a backdrop as we go forward. This is just an example of some of the ones that we might cover if we were working on a strategy with someone. With that, I'll let Michael Smart pick up and talk about data centricity and platforms.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Right. So we would propose to move to a platform-based architecture. You know, we want to move from the current situation, sort of on the left there, where we typically have many non-integrated solutions. There's often a lot of redundancies. You know, we have multiple systems doing the same thing. You know, we want to move from there to a more rationalized environment focused on business value. So by moving to a platform way of thinking, we mean thinking of things, as a suite of modules, applications, components, and services that are used together to deliver multiple complex business processes. So these are not typically single vendor platforms. It's more about assembling the best rationalized set of tools to deliver business capability and managing them in a coordinated and cohesive way. So, for example, if we look at content and document management capability, typically there are many different flavors of that in an organization, maybe meeting slightly different needs, but those could be managed as a platform service. We can rationalize those tools, offer standard services, and reuse components. Okay, so if we could go to the next screen. Yeah, so how does this platform approach fit with the concept of data centricity, and why does data centricity matter? If you could click there. So yeah, in a pure data centric model, we have sort of one data model. It's a shared set of controlled vocabulary and common semantics. All the applications read and write to that same data model. And we have standardization and harmonization of data. The benefits are really independence of data from applications and evergreening of data. The data are readily fair, compliant, and we reduce sort of integration complexity. Yep. Next. However, the reality though is that it's not that easy to realize this type of thing in practice. Obviously, we have a lot of commercial applications. They have their own data models, metadata, controlled vocabulary, with application code tied to those models. So these aren't really designed to work with a common data model, and that paradigm isn't really changing. At this point in time, that's sort of notwithstanding newer architecture patterns like microservices, that type of thing does go some way towards alleviating things, but that also brings other complications. So yes, next slide. So some way to get closer to that data-centric model then is to implement a logical managed data hub approach. So the logical data hub's purpose is really to unify data and conform data products, establish master and reference data, and manage the controlled vocabulary and key business concepts. The approach is then to drive our application platforms really to be publishers and subscribers to that data hub. So, reading the master and reference data there, getting subscribing to the conformed domain data from that hub. The application platforms provide their functions, adding to, transforming and enriching the data, and then publish or write that data back to the hub where it can be unified with the other data sets from other sources. The logical data hub centered around a common semantic data model, which is extensible and facilitates business content, search, and navigation. So the platform thinking and the logical data hub architecture get us sort of closer to that goal of data centricity. But how do we get started on implementing all of that? For that discussion, I wanted to hand back to Susan to pick up the conversation.
Thanks, Michael. So just that serves as a useful backdrop to help understand some of what we're trying to do as we pull together technical strategies with our clients. So typically when we're working with our clients, we work in these primary 6 areas. We want to make sure that everyone is aligned around guiding elements associated with the program. We work to define capabilities. This can happen in various time frames as we work forward. It depends on the client and the ability to provide time and access. But we work to define those capabilities at varying levels. We put together then, using those capabilities, a conceptual architecture. We prioritize where the greatest need is for the business. We may look at strategic vendors and strategic partners who are out there to understand how that might influence the way forward, and then use all of that information to help pull together a strategic roadmap. I'll show a few examples of all of these to help clarify what we're talking about. So when we do the initiation portion, we're looking at defining strategic direction for the strategy setting. So part of that is guiding principles. We might also have vision. We might be looking at what are the key business imperatives or the burning platforms that are out there, and different kind of platform there, but the burning issues, if you will, that are facing each respective organization, to ensure that those are addressed and that the strategy is set to do that. So we typically will define all of those elements up front, including guiding principles that might look at architecture, might look at data or information, how you want to deliver and what you want the user's experiences to be like. So this is just some examples that help to clarify the kinds of guidance that drives all of the decisions that go forward as you put the strategy together. Could go forward one. And then we work to put together the business and technical capabilities. So in a clinical development space, we're usually using some type of framework that looks at the core business process, as you can see in the middle, but also looks at all the cross-cutting capabilities, both more operationally, as you see at the bottom, but also from a data and an analytics perspective. What is needed here? And as I mentioned earlier, we have tech trends, we have emerging technologies. Those are all out there, and we want to look at all of that together and use that framework to identify what are the key capabilities for each organization, how do they relate to the different parts of the process and need in the business. And we look at it from both a foundational, what is core, must have, you have it today and you don't want to lose it, but also aspirational. What is it you want for the future? And through that, we often have to have a IGO discussion, issues, gaps, and opportunities. We'd like to be able to do these things. These are areas where we're having problems today, and kind of understanding the root cause of those issues, so that as we look to the future, we can think about those and make sure we don't build those back into the future state architecture and roadmap. If you go forward, please. And then using those capabilities as a backdrop, we work to put together a conceptual technical architecture. And typically we are, as Michael indicated, looking to try to do this from a platform concept, so that we're building in the need and the capabilities to support both foundational and aspirational needs. But we want to ensure we cover the cross-cutting. So if you look at this, for example, we deal with data in the bottom, and then in the center section, we have cross-cutting types of platforms that could be used by biostats, could be used by CDM, clinical data management, could be used by ClinOps, et cetera, where all those groups are able to access and use common platforms rather than building their own for their own use. And then we have the more transactional systems at the top, and those platforms up there that support specific needs within the business. So we define that conceptual technical architecture. Obviously, in clinical, there's a lot of commonality across organizations, but there's always specific needs that get surfaced that show in the next level type of detail, like what Michael showed previously when we looked at the data hub concept. So if you go forward. Once we've defined those platforms and capabilities that need to be supported, then we look at doing prioritization with the client. So what is really critical to be done as we go forward and we start thinking strategically? So often we have what we call must-do capabilities. So these are ones where you can't not do it. They have to be there, regardless of where they might fall as different groups weigh in on their priorities. They just have to be there. They're very foundational, and they need to be there. Now, you can build them in an extensible way where you start smaller and build out, but still we know we have to have those. And then we work with the organizations to prioritize where is the greatest need in their area, both from a purely business perspective, which is what you see in priority, but then there's also a tempering there around the urgency. Like, okay, this is high priority, but we already have a lot there, and we can use that while we're building out other things, and maybe there's other areas where it's more urgent for us to get that work done earlier in our roadmap because there's no solutions there today. So we try to prioritize looking at both the business priority and then also what is the urgency from a technology need perspective. If you want to flip forward. But we also know that you all have existing solutions in place. And as part of this, early on, while we're doing the capabilities work, we usually do a systems assessment of your current systems. We want to understand your current and existing architecture. And we often have to think about how does this architecture fit with that conceptual architecture for the future. And as part of that, we can do some rationalization, which weighs in and feeds into the roadmap work. So are you going to continue with this technology and invest in it? Are you just going to maintain it and not invest at this time because you want to, you may have other solutions that are coming in at some point? Are you going to replace it, or are you going to ultimately eliminate that? And we look at it again, looking both at your business priority and your urgency in terms of needing to get that done. Okay, if you go forward. And then the final element prior to road mapping is understanding what's happening in the vendor landscape. So we'll often do RFIs where we help to evaluate both your current solutions, but also solutions that may be out there in the marketplace, but that you do not currently have in-house or that are emerging. And those might be looked at in particular areas. So often we'll have vendors who are big players in the clinical space, but we also might have some groups like a Microsoft or a Google or others who might be able to provide some other information that might help fulfill needs and make it, identify strategic partners for data platforms where they may not play any other area, or analytics and visualization if they don't play in other areas. So we try to look at that holistically, identify those vendors that make the most sense, and then assess them accordingly. And use that again as a way to say, all right, we have, some core strategic vendors that have the potential to be stood up. So that needs to play into our roadmap because we want to make certain assumptions that we're going to, move to a particular set of vendors that help us achieve our vision. I'm going to go forward. And then finally, all of that culminates in the development of a high-level strategic roadmap. We typically break our roadmaps down into 3 different primary areas. We have a high-level summary overview. It's usually work-stream driven, so those work streams can tie to a variety of different mechanisms. It can be organizational, it can be based on product lines if you have product line organization set up. It can be based on business outcomes. You want to achieve certain kinds of outcomes. But we develop that high-level roadmap, and then that drills down into deeper and deeper levels of detail. So we have a work stream level then that might have additional detail that you see in that summary view, and they're all clicked down, usually in PowerPoint, but we usually have also a Microsoft project starter that resides behind all of this. And then finally, we have more detailed work descriptions that serve as a preliminary charter for the project and for implementation that can help you spin up work streams at the right time and not lose strategic intent. So if you can imagine, by the time you get to some of those things that might be shown in that mid-range phase in the high-level overview, the actual initial strategy work may have occurred a while ago. You want to make sure you don't lose strategic intent as these different teams spin up to implement their specific work streams. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these roadmaps are built to be living documents. They need to evolve over time. Technology continues to change. But by using a platform data-centric model for your strategies and for your future ecosystems, it gives you that opportunity to more easily and rapidly make course streams adjustments, bring in new technologies, and support those from a business capability perspective. Bob, do you want to pick up at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. All of this doesn't really hold water if you don't bring different constituents along with you throughout the project. So it's important to get alignment along the way. So leadership right from the get-go and setting the tone, driving through the business imperatives, making sure they're well understood, communicating decisions and intent along the way is critical. Continuing to prioritize, kind of as Susan was discussing there, priority in terms of capabilities, in terms of technology, in terms of urgency. So all those things get factored into the alignment process. And then making sure that stakeholder voices are heard and leveraged throughout, because clinical development covers a pretty wide swath of the organization. So there's lots of different stakeholder voices that need to be accounted for. And then being transparent in the decision-making, priorities, and the way the strategic roadmap comes out. Really important to bring everybody along, get people aligned, supporting the strategy. And it's not just a one-time thing, that's throughout the implementation efforts that are going on and any strategy refreshes that are happening as well. So that's all for us. Let me turn it back over to Kevin. May have come in. Kevin? Kevin, I think you're on mute, maybe. Oh,
Guys, are you hearing? No, I'm here. Are you hearing me okay?
There you go. Now we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. I think I had my my one headset was on mute. I was trying to reduce some feedback there. So, couple of things. If you haven't asked any questions yet for the attendees on there, I want to obviously encourage you to ask as many as you'd like. You'll see the question function there on the right-hand side of your screen, as I mentioned in the beginning. I do want to get the recording stopped.